Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about research and how it's published. And this is going to be useful to you because it gives you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes understanding of how all this scholarship that you're reading comes to be. This is also important for understanding sort of some of the limitations of that process and ways that we can be aware of what might be going on when we're seeing certain types of tendencies in the literature. All right. So remember, when we think about the overall scientific process, one of the major things that we need to consider is the ability of the scientific community to engage with scholarship that's produced. And this process of community analysis and feedback is actually crucial to assessing the quality of scholarship, how useful it will be, and coming up with new ideas for how to advance a field. Now, one of the major ways that this occurs is through publication, the peer review process in that publication, which I'll talk about shortly, and replication of multiple publications over time. So these things sort of work together to generate new ideas and advance our understanding of an area. But publication is a really crucial component to evidence-based practice and research. So within research fields where academics and other researchers are responsible for publishing, there is a term which is publish or perish, and that is kind of what it sounds like. So there's this idea that or there's this reality that people who are producing scholarship, who are doing research, really need to pump out many publications in order to keep their jobs. This is actually this makes sense because we want scholars to actually be producing information that can help advance our understanding in the field. So it makes sense that would be a requirement and expectation of a job. But it is kind of a often brutal requirement. Sometimes it used to be that, academics had to publish, but it wasn't something that had to happen with the regularity that needs to happen now. There's a tremendous amount of pressure to publish in high impact journals. And even people who do really well with that are not guaranteed to actually get a job, the type of job that they want. And I will emphasize here that this is really important to people's careers. So if you don't publish, there's a real probability that you'll possibly lose your job. You'll have to move your family across the country because there aren't a lot of jobs out there. You'll be competing for other jobs. If you don't publish enough and you lose a job, it actually in academia becomes much harder to get another job. So it's a very high pressure kind of situation. It's also harder because there's more and more researchers out there who are publishing papers. So there's a lot more competition that's occurring. So I bring this up just to understand the context of why publications, beyond just scientists' desire to contribute to the field, is actually really crucial to their careers. So one of the things that happens when you have this type of pressure around publishing is that there are side effects that occur that are sometimes negative for our understanding of the overall scholarship and advancing the knowledge of the field. So sometimes people publish things before they're quite ready to be published, just because they need to get something out the door. There's another thing which you should be aware of, which is called salami slicing, where someone takes a project that makes sense as one thing, and then they take little bits of that project and publish them separately, so they get more papers out of one sort of project. And this has a disadvantage because it sort of distributes knowledge. It makes it harder to combine it together. There's also a big problem around what's called data dredging, which is essentially collecting tons and tons of data and then looking through it using statistics to look through lots of different variables, lots of different factors to try and see if there's any statistically significant relationship without any hypothesis about what those relationships might be. And once you find the significant relationship, then you write up a paper about it, create your hypothesis, create a paper based upon that. And that's a problem because that can lead to false false findings that aren't carried out through replication. So this can sort of lead the field astray. The other thing, and probably the most important thing to recognize, is that when you're thinking about publishing and you're thinking about the publish or perish scenario, that there is spin in how people present their work. What I mean by spin is when you write a paper, you will sometimes overemphasize the things that seem to be significant or exciting. You might diminish or not quite be as transparent about some of the failings of that paper so that people reading it may not understand the true implications of your research. And this is something that's very common because, as I mentioned, in the publish or perish scenario, you really want to get your papers accepted by a journal. And if you don't, you're in trouble. So there is those real challenges. And, I think when I think about my own scholarship, I know that I've certainly, when I wrote papers, I've always tried to be honest about things, but I've certainly emphasized certain things more because I thought that they'd be exciting to the readers, to the publishers, and make them more likely to be published. So this is something that, there's ranges of this. And when you push that too far, then you start having problems in terms of the integrity of the research that's produced. So something to sort of think about when you think about the role of the researcher in producing scholarship and writing that scholarship and deciding how they want to present that information to their readers. So when it comes to actually publishing is a huge deal. There's a very large publishing field. There's actually 5 large sort of publishers that do actually almost about half of publications come from those 5 large publishers. So there is sort of a bit of a monopoly on scholarly publication. But this is big in the sense that it's about 2.5 million papers being produced per year, roughly about now. There's also about 30,000 scholarly peer-reviewed journals. So there's a lot of different journals that have a lot of different focuses. So you can put your work in a journal that you think will reach the audience that you're interested in talking to. Plus, there's a bunch of thousands of predatory journals, which are not really scholarly journals, or kind of like fake journals. So we'll talk about that in a second. So when you think about publishing, a researcher who's spent a lot of time doing this research, spent a lot of time writing this paper, they make informed decisions about what journal they want to publish in. So the most important thing probably is getting it into a journal that they think people in their field will read, right? So it's something a journal that's respected and recognized by their peers. The other thing is the impact factor of the journal. So there's some journals that are really famous, Science and Nature, for example. Those are journals that if you publish in it, it's a really big deal. It's really hard to get a paper published in those journals. And because those journals are highly recognized and a lot of people cite them, a lot of people use those papers, their impact factor goes up, which is essentially a score for how important the journal is in terms of affecting overall scholarship. There's also measures that you can do to measure the success of individual researchers or how well cited a certain article is as well. In terms of journals, another question you might ask is it open access? So we know that there's increasing pressure to have journals that anybody can access papers from it. And that's important for a range of different reasons, but one of the reasons for that is that the public pays for a lot of research that occurs through grants that come through the government. And it's a problem that people are paying for this scholarship to be produced, but the general public can't get access to that information. So increasingly, there's interest in having journals that are open access so anybody can get to those papers. Very often, though, to publish in an open access journal, you have to pay more money as a researcher. You have to actually pay the journal to publish your paper. Another thing you consider is like how long does that journal take to publish it from when you submit it to the journal to when it actually comes out in press. And of course, the cost of publishing a paper. which can be from hundreds into multiple thousands of dollars to get your paper published. So let me talk a little bit about some of the major journals that are out there. So I mentioned impact factor, which is a score that's assigned to different journals. Here's a list of the top 15 nursing journals based upon the ISI Reuters Web of Science impact factor. It's a certain scheme for measuring the impact of these different journals. So you'll see a range of different journals in nursing areas, many of which you're probably may be familiar with. If you're looking at public health related scholarship, here's the list of the top 15 for public health. You'll see that a lot of them are review journals. So review journals often get a lot of citations because of the fact that they publish reviews that overlook a certain area of a field. So they get cited more often. So very often we see those popping up in those public health areas. And we saw some in the nursing as well. Another way of measuring the citation index for journals or getting the impact factor for journals is using Google Scholar. So Google Scholar has a different algorithm for doing this. I think it's actually pretty good at measuring this. So you'll see using their different algorithm, you also see some of the top journals that come out using that approach. And this is for nursing in 2018, and this one is for public health in 2018. All right. So I want you to be aware that the quality of journals varies. There are journals out there which are called predatory journals. So predatory journals are journals that typically do not have a real, they may not even be publishing real research. They may not be publishing regularly. They may not have a real peer review process or a meaningful peer review process. And they often charge a lot of money to publish papers. So these are journals that are really suspicious and sometimes actually even fake. So that essentially anything that you submit to that journal will be published. So that's a real problem because we rely on the peer review process to screen out papers that probably are not of high quality. So it's really important to be able to recognize these predatory journals when you see them. One is you can look at the impact factor for journals. So if they aren't scored with these impact factors relatively highly using Google or the ISI framework, that might indicate that they're not a real journal, all right? Or they might not have the support to be doing the proper peer review that they need to be doing. So you got to be really careful. Just because something shows up in a journal when you search for it doesn't necessarily mean that it's high quality, even if it's formatted and looks like it's a high quality paper. Knowing something about the journals that you're looking at can be quite important. I think it's kind of fun to just show an example of this. These predatory journals, as I mentioned, or actually I don't even know if this is a predatory journal per se, but some of the lower level journals do not have a very good peer review process. So one, they might not be able to find enough people to do the peer review. In other cases, they might not be finding people who are really experts in the field that they're looking at. Here's a publication which looks nice. It looks fine. It looks like a normal publication reviewing mitochondria structure, function, and clinical relevance. Sounds good. Until you start reading into the paper and you find out that this is actually a scam article, which was intended as a sting to just show how problematic these types of journals are. And they're talking about midichlorians, which is a Star Wars concept that's the basis of the Force. And if you go on, they talk about Darth Vader and, the Dark Force and the different forces that come from mitochondria in the actual paper itself. And this went through peer review and got published. So point being here, and this is obviously not part of standard understanding of how biology works. So point here being that you can get a wide range of different things published in journals, especially predatory journals, Rick and Morty. There's been a bunch of different things where people have published all sorts of ridiculous things in journals that make no sense whatsoever, and yet they still get published. So point here being, just because something's published in something that looks like a journal does not necessarily mean that it's high quality. What I will say is, as you're looking at journals, if they look like have lots of spelling errors, if they look like they don't look like they were very carefully put together, that's generally a hint that they're probably a lower level journal or possibly a predatory journal. All right. So let's talk about the peer review process. So you identify a journal, and then you decide to submit it to this journal. So the way that this works is you put your paper in, you submit it through usually an online platform, and the paper goes to an editor. So editors are folks who have some level of knowledge about the field that they're interested in. The higher level journals will have people who are really top experts in those areas. Lower level journals will sometimes have people who don't have much knowledge about those areas of scholarship. So that does make a difference. The editors will look at a paper and see whether or not it seems to meet a basic level of quality and whether or not it's something that they think would be interesting for their journal to publish. If the editor thinks that is interesting, they will identify peer reviewers. So they'll send it out to those peer reviewers who will then review the manuscript. So peer reviewers are folks who have expertise in the field that the paper is aligned with. So they should be able to assess whether or not it's important, assess whether the methods that were used were appropriate or not, and give a critical review of that paper. All right. So it goes out to the peer reviewers, and that can take months for them to look through it, and then they will give back a recommendation to the editor. So the editor then will decide whether or not they think that the reviewers suggest that this is a good enough paper. If they think that it's really terrible, then usually the paper will be rejected. If they think that it's has promise, but it still has substantial problems with it, very often they'll recommend that paper get revised. If they think it's really fantastic and stellar, sometimes they'll recommend that you just accept it straight out. I personally have published a lot of papers, and I've never had one just accepted on the first round. So very often there's multiple rounds where the paper will be sent back to the author, and the author will revise that paper, give it back to the editor, and it will go back to reviewers. And you'll go through sometimes 1, 2, 3 cycles between the author and the peer reviewers. So sometimes, even after going through that process, it will still be rejected. Other times, it will be accepted and will go to be prepared for production, for being published, and then ultimately will be published in the journal. So this can take a fair bit of time. It's not uncommon for this to take 6 months, a year sometimes. It varies depending on the journal, but it can often take quite a while to go through this whole process. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the peer review process. So the peer review process is a really crucial safeguard for the scientific community. And that's because what you're doing is you're presenting your scholarship to your peers who are experts in your field, and they are going to go through it carefully, or they should be going through it carefully to assess it for its importance and also for its quality. And that's really important to make sure that papers meet sort of the criteria for entering into the general knowledge of that field. So, overall, the peer review process does make a difference. And generally speaking, if you survey researchers, they actually do feel that their papers are better after going through the peer review process. That being said, it's a really brutal process very often. So you can have people who are really unkind about your papers, which is hard when you've poured your heart and soul into writing this thing and doing this scholarship. And it can be a really grueling process of sort of changing your paper through multiple rounds of edits to meet the expectations of those reviewers. And that can be a challenge, and sometimes a quality-related challenge, because sometimes the reviewers want you to do something that you don't think is accurate or doesn't convey the information as well as you like. So it's often a give or take in that process. And it's hard. It's always hard, even though it's really important to get critical feedback on your work. It's always hard to go through that process. All this being said, peer review varies in terms of quality. I've gotten a range of different types of peer reviews. These are two different reviews I got in the same, I think it's the same paper that I pulled it out of. And you can see in one of the reviews, they essentially say, this is pretty good. And that's about the only thing that they said. They didn't give me a lot of suggestions. They didn't really analyze it very much. They essentially checked the box, right? On the other side, you'll see a review where the reviewer went through and paragraph went in and said, here's different problems I see. Here's what you need to do to fix them. And gave fairly specific suggestions and recommendations for what I should do in the paper to revise it. Now, of the peer reviews I've seen, of the more careful peer reviews, that's actually even the shorter one. I've had peer reviews that are, 2, 3 pages, 4 pages sometimes, that very carefully go through my work. Now, the quality of your peer review is going to depend on the prominence of the journal in some senses. So more prominent journals are more successful at pulling in more prominent reviewers, right, who will be a closer expert in your field and be more capable of providing that feedback. So it is possible, though, that you could go through peer review and the peer reviews could be quite skimpy and maybe not very critical, and peer reviewers may not have looked at this very carefully. And part of this is because peer reviewers don't get paid for doing that work. They do it out of the goodness of their hearts, and that means that the quality may vary. So it's a very important process in the scientific community, but the quality of that process for checking scholarship, making sure that scholarship is of high quality, will sometimes vary. So you do see papers getting through that process sometimes that are wrong. So we can't count on the peer review process to ensure that every paper that we see is actually correct or doesn't have major flaws in it. That being said, it catches a lot of that. It is incredibly helpful. I know that's helped me as a scholar to do better work conveying my work, be able to explain my methods, and be able to describe the limitations of those methods as well. All right, so let's go on to talk a little bit more about that peer review process and what it means. I think that there's some things that you should know about this publication process that are pretty important. And one of them is some of the biases that come into this process in terms of what is published and what we actually end up seeing. So this is, I'm showing a figure from an article that looked at research on antidepressants, all right? And it was looking at trials where they could actually find out information about the trials have been registered, so they could find out information about those trials, even trials that didn't get published. So in the first column, in column A, what you'll see is that there's a bunch of dots. The red dots mean publications that, or research that found that there was no association between antidepressant and depression, which was the original hypothesis of that scholarship. Now, in the next column over, what you'll see is what's called study of publication bias. And what this means is that essentially when you're looking at papers that get published versus papers that get rejected from journals, very often papers that suggest that nothing's going on in a relationship between a drug and a health outcome are seen as less exciting, and therefore they don't get published. And this is called publication bias. So you have an overrepresentation of findings from papers that saw something interesting in the relationship between a medication and a health outcome, right? And this is called publication bias overall. So we see this in a lot of areas. Now there's other types of bias that we see coming out in these types of papers. And this is called outcome reporting bias. So sometimes what you'll find is if you look at even the papers among the ones that were actually published, if you look at those papers and see what they talk about, sometimes what they'll do is, since their paper doesn't look very exciting because it didn't support the hypothesis of relationship with depression, what they'll do is they'll pick something else that there was a significant relationship with, or they'll kind of change how it was presented. So, for example, if you were studying the relationship between a drug and depression, and you looked at a bunch of different outcomes, and there's no relationship between a drug and depression, maybe if you looked at different outcomes, you found, oh, well, it seems like there's a statistical relationship with the medication and suicide. Let's just say that that's the case. Well, then you could publish a paper about that by shifting the outcome that you're looking at. All right. And then you could write a paper that sounds like you found a significant association that sounds more exciting. So you're more likely to get published. So we saw that actually for a fair number of those papers, which showed no relationship between a medication and depression, they actually get published based upon that shifting how they talked about the topic, and reporting that topic. All right. So then we see move over to the next one, which is talking about spin. So I talked earlier about how the fact that as a researcher, you can change how you talk about things. So you can talk about things so that it sounds better, or that you switch the focus of what you're describing, or you use sort of vague terms instead of saying that there was a statistically significant relationship between a drug and depression outcome. You might say that there seem to be trends towards this being a relationship, even if it wasn't statistically significant, right? So these are things that researchers can do to make it sound better so that it will get published. Again, remember, researchers are under a lot of pressure to get their papers published. They might have spent years working on this research project, and for grants, they might have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars for some of these studies, and they need to show something for it. So they might shift how they talk about this, and bias, sort of have that bias come into their paper. Okay. Now, in the final column, you'll see how different papers are cited. So again, the citations that a paper gets sort of indicates the extent to which it's impacting a field, the extent to which other people are seeing it and paying attention to it. And what we see here in this one is that the size of the dot is an indicator for how many times it was cited in the literature. And what you see is that the papers that were had no results, showed no association between a drug and a depression, just weren't cited very much. It just wasn't seen as being as exciting. So we didn't see it come to prominence in that field. All right. So what this is suggesting overall is that we can have, if you go and search the literature that you find may not actually be representative of what all the scholarship that is actually out there. So we saw the original thing where it's pretty much split between studies indicating positive health impacts versus studies saying that there's no relationship, right? But we look at that final column, and it's suggesting that there's a real misrepresentation of those initial findings, right? So this is just to demonstrate to you that what we find, what we see in our literature reviews, we have to be somewhat careful about what that looks like. And if people haven't done a careful job in terms of reviewing that literature, they might miss some of these negative findings that are actually pretty important for advancing our understanding. So there are some countermeasures for dealing with these types of problems. So there are journals that now publish, and sometimes are designed specifically to publish negative results that suggest that there's no relationship. So these studies that previously would not have been published can still enter into the scientific literature, so you can find it. So one of the concerns is that you wouldn't even be able to find it because it'd never be published, right? The other thing that you can look at is systematic reviews sometimes, and very often meta-analyses. So meta-analyses and systematic reviews are a special type of review that looks at the literature in a field and tries to find every paper, both papers that show positive results and papers that suggest that there's no relationship going on. And And they can also sometimes detect if there's a possibility of publication bias. So there's a way of statistically examining findings to see if it seems like certain publications that have positive findings seem to be published at a higher rate. The other thing that is really important here is sort of the integrity of the field in terms of carefully investigating a question, in terms of having those conversations at conferences, and putting in the effort to find those negative results as well to see whether or not something is really going on. All right, so still an active conversation. It's still a real challenge for the research professions, but it's important to understand when we look at the body of literature to just understand what it might mean and what it might not mean. All right, so that's a brief overview of how papers are published, and I hope that gives you some insight into some of the motivations about how people write, why they write, what the pressures are that they're dealing with, then thoughts about different types of journals and understanding about the different levels of quality that these journals have, and then talking a little bit more about the review process, how these papers get examined, how they get improved by peer review, but also some of the challenges to that process as well. And again, the fact that we do have some biases that get integrated into this process that may affect the overall body of literature that we see. All right, thank you very much and take care.